We have to finally be clear-eyed about the sort of man Trump is and treat him accordingly. He is a bully. He thinks he can grab whatever he wants, using force if necessary. And he is corrupt. The most corrupt president the United States has ever seen.
Donald Trump is unraveling, and the reaction across Europe shows just how serious the situation has become. European leaders are scrambling today after Trump issued an extraordinary and destabilizing threat: impose sweeping tariffs on European nations unless they support a United States invasion of Greenland. That announcement alone was enough to trigger emergency discussions among European Union ambassadors in Brussels as officials attempt to assess what Trump's move means for European sovereignty, global trade, and international security. According to multiple reports, Trump has threatened to slap additional tariffs ranging anywhere from 10% to as high as 25% on European countries that refuse to cooperate with his demands.
Ambassadors from the European Union's 27 member countries are holding an emergency meeting today to discuss President Trump's tariff threats. Trump says 8 NATO allies will face tariffs if they don't support his plan to take over Greenland. Meanwhile, people are taking to the streets in Copenhagen and in Greenland, sending a clear message. They do not want to be part of the United States.
The tariffs would target nations that either publicly oppose a U.S. military move against Greenland or have taken steps to assist Denmark and Greenland in defending the territory. Even more alarming, Trump reportedly singled out countries that have deployed special forces or military advisors to Greenland as potential targets for economic punishment. This has sent shockwaves through European capitals. The European Union had already been engaged in delicate negotiations with the United States over a major transatlantic trade deal, one that was seen as critical for stabilizing economic relations amid global uncertainty. Now, EU lawmakers are preparing to halt approval of that agreement altogether.
Learning that European Union lawmakers are now set to halt the approval of the European Union's trade deal with the United States, since Donald Trump has stated that he will be imposing 15 or 10 or 25% or even more tariffs on certain European countries.
The reasoning is simple. If the United States is openly threatening economic warfare to coerce European governments into backing a territorial invasion, then there is no foundation of trust on which to build a trade partnership. Behind closed doors in Brussels, diplomats are reportedly furious. Many see Trump's threats not just as economic pressure, but as outright political blackmail, using tariffs as leverage to force European nations to abandon their own security commitments and international law obligations. The fact that Greenland is an autonomous territory tied to Denmark, a NATO ally.
How are our European allies reacting, and what are we hearing from Trump officials this morning justifying the tariff move?
Well, our European allies, they're outraged and they're scrambling on how to respond to this latest tariff threat. You have heard from Sweden. They're calling this move from President Trump blackmail. France says they're not going to be influenced by the president's intimidation.
Has only intensified the sense that Trump is crossing a line that no modern U.S. president has crossed before. European leaders have now begun responding publicly, and the tone is unmistakably defiant. The Swedish Prime Minister was among the first to speak out, delivering a sharp rebuke that left little room for misinterpretation. He made it clear that Sweden would not be intimidated, stating unequivocally that only Denmark and Greenland have the authority to decide matters concerning Greenland's future.
The use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. It is not the right way to resolve differences within an alliance. Nor is it helpful to frame efforts to strengthen Greenland's security as a justification for economic pressure.
He emphasized that Sweden would always stand up for its own country and for its allied neighbors, and that Trump's threats represent an issue affecting the entire European Union, not just the countries Trump has tried to single out. Sweden, the Prime Minister explained, is now engaged in intensive discussions with other EU member states, as well as Norway and the United Kingdom, to coordinate a unified response. That coordination is key because European leaders understand that Trump's strategy depends on division.
First of all, there are no threats against Greenland. The only threat is the United States. This talk about China threatening Greenland is a fake story. They don't have any activity there. They don't even have a consulate. They don't have any mining. They don't own anything, and certainly nothing militarily.
If countries respond individually, the pressure becomes easier to apply. If they respond collectively, the threat loses much of its force. France followed with an even more forceful statement. French President Emmanuel Macron responded directly to Trump's tariff threats against France and other nations involved in protecting Greenland. He framed the issue not as a dispute over trade, but as a fundamental question of sovereignty and international law. France, Macron said, is committed to the independence and sovereignty of nations in Europe and beyond. That commitment, he explained, is rooted in Europe's adherence to the United Nations Charter and the principles that have guided post-war global stability. Macron made clear that this same commitment is what drives France's support for Ukraine and what led to the creation of a coalition of willing nations to defend peace and security against aggression. He stressed that the decision to participate in military exercises with Denmark and Greenland was not symbolic, but deliberate, especially given the growing importance of Arctic security and Europe's northern frontiers. Then came the most pointed part of his remarks. Macron stated plainly that no intimidation and no threat would influence France's decisions, not in Ukraine, not in Greenland, not anywhere else in the world. The message was unmistakable. France will not bow to coercion, whether it comes from military aggression or economic blackmail. The subtext was equally clear. Macron was drawing a direct line between Russian aggression in Ukraine and Trump's threats over Greenland, suggesting that both represent assaults on sovereignty that Europe cannot tolerate. By doing so, he placed Trump's actions in the same category as the very conduct Europe has spent years condemning. Macron went further, rejecting the tariff threats outright. He said such threats are unacceptable and have no place in discussions about security and sovereignty. If the tariffs are confirmed, he warned, Europe will respond in a united and coordinated manner. Europe, he said, knows how to defend its sovereignty, and it will do so. That declaration marked a turning point. This is no longer a theoretical dispute or a rhetorical clash. European governments are now actively preparing countermeasures, both economic and diplomatic. The possibility of retaliatory tariffs, trade freezes, and coordinated responses through international institutions is now very real. And the fact that this escalation stems from a demand that Europe support a U.S. invasion of Greenland has left many officials openly questioning whether Trump understands or cares about the consequences of his actions. As Macron prepares to speak further with European partners, one thing is clear. Trump's attempt to strong-arm Europe has backfired. Instead of isolating individual countries, he has triggered a collective response. Instead of asserting dominance, he has united allies against him. And instead of bending Europe to his will, he has exposed just how unstable and dangerous his approach to global leadership has become. And this is only the beginning of the fallout. The fallout from Trump's threat didn't stop with Sweden and France. Across Europe, officials immediately began framing this not as a bilateral dispute with Washington, but as a systemic challenge to European sovereignty and the post-war order itself. Diplomats described the atmosphere in Brussels as tense and urgent, with ambassadors warning that Trump's rhetoric marks a dangerous escalation from trade disputes into coercive foreign policy. Tariffs, they argue, are being repurposed as weapons to force political submission, and that crosses a red line. European lawmakers are now openly discussing freezing or outright halting the approval process for the long-negotiated EU-US trade agreement. That deal was already controversial, but Trump's threats have transformed skepticism into outright opposition. Several members of the European Parliament have said there is no scenario in which Europe should deepen economic ties with a country that openly threatens economic punishment to coerce military alignment. In their view, approving a trade deal under these circumstances would reward bullying behavior and invite more of it. What's especially alarming to European officials is the precedent this would set. If tariffs can be used to pressure allies into supporting territorial expansion, then no treaty, no alliance, and no agreement is truly safe. Today, it's Greenland. Tomorrow, it could be something else. And that uncertainty is what has pushed leaders to act quickly and collectively. Behind the scenes, defense ministers and foreign affairs officials are coordinating messaging to ensure there are no mixed signals. The goal is clarity and unity. Trump's approach thrives on chaos and ambiguity, on exploiting divisions and forcing countries to calculate their own exposure. European leaders appear determined not to fall into that trap. Instead, they are presenting a unified front that rejects both the premise of Trump's demand and the method he's using to enforce it. Several officials have also raised concerns about NATO. Greenland is strategically significant, particularly in the Arctic, and any unilateral U.S. action there would have serious implications for alliance cohesion. NATO operates on collective defense and mutual respect for sovereignty. Trump's threats undermine that framework by implying that alliance obligations can be overridden through economic coercion. That has led to quiet but intense discussions about how far Europe can rely on U.S. leadership under such conditions. There is also growing anger about the way Trump has personalized the issue. Rather than engaging through diplomatic channels, he has framed the dispute as a transactional demand: support the invasion or face punishment. European leaders view this as reckless and destabilizing, especially at a time when global tensions are already high. The Arctic, in particular, is seen as a fragile region where militarization could have long-term consequences. Introducing economic threats into that environment only increases the risk of escalation. France's remarks resonated so strongly because they articulated what many European leaders were thinking, but had not yet said so plainly. By linking Trump's threats to broader patterns of intimidation, whether from authoritarian regimes or economic bullies, France effectively reframed the debate. This is no longer about America versus Europe. It's about whether the rules that have governed international relations for decades still matter. Sweden's emphasis on coordination with Norway and the United Kingdom underscores how far this has spread beyond the EU itself. This is becoming a pan-European issue, one that touches non-EU partners and reshapes regional security calculations. The conversations happening now are not limited to tariffs and trade. They include military posture, diplomatic alliances, and contingency planning if Trump follows through on his threats. And that's what has many observers concluding that Trump badly miscalculated. Instead of isolating a few countries and forcing concessions, he has galvanized a broader coalition. Countries that might otherwise have taken a cautious or neutral stance are now being pulled into collective action simply to defend the principle that borders and sovereignty cannot be negotiated at gunpoint or tariff point. As this unfolds, Trump's reaction has reportedly been one of frustration and anger. Rather than softening his stance, he has doubled down rhetorically, portraying Europe's resistance as betrayal. That only deepens the divide. European officials say privately that this confirms their worst fears, that Trump views alliances not as partnerships but as leverage points to be exploited. The next phase will likely involve formal statements, potential retaliatory measures, and further diplomatic engagement aimed at containing the damage. But the trust that has been eroded will not be easily restored. Even if Trump backs off, the message has been received. Europe is now preparing for a future in which U.S. policy can shift abruptly, driven by impulse rather than consensus. And looming over all of this is the reality that Trump's threats have already achieved one thing. They have forced Europe to confront, openly and urgently, the question of how to defend itself, economically, politically, and strategically, against pressure not just from adversaries, but from a partner that no longer seems predictable. What happens next may define transatlantic relations for years, because Europe is now being forced to prepare not just for the possibility that Trump follows through, but for the reality that the threat itself has already altered the landscape. Even if no tariff is ultimately imposed, even if no military move ever materializes, the damage to trust is already done. European leaders are treating this as a warning shot, a signal that the United States under Trump is willing to weaponize its economic power against allies to achieve geopolitical goals that violate long-standing norms. That realization is pushing conversations that were once theoretical into the realm of urgency. European officials are now openly discussing the need for greater strategic autonomy. That means reducing dependence on U.S. trade leverage, strengthening internal supply chains, and accelerating defense coordination that does not rely exclusively on Washington's goodwill. These discussions were happening quietly before, but Trump's threats have dragged them into the open. The Arctic dimension makes this even more volatile. Greenland is not just a symbolic territory. It sits at the center of emerging global competition as melting ice opens new shipping routes and access to resources. European leaders see stability in the Arctic as critical, and they view any unilateral move, especially one backed by economic coercion, as a destabilizing act that could invite further militarization by other powers. That is why Trump's rhetoric has triggered alarm well beyond Denmark and Greenland themselves. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk added another layer to the growing chorus of opposition, warning that Europe cannot allow itself to be divided or intimidated. His message echoed what others have been saying privately, that yielding to this kind of pressure would not make Europe safer, but weaker, and weakness in the current global environment is an invitation to further aggression from anyone watching closely. What's also striking is how quickly the narrative has shifted. This is no longer framed in Europe as a Trump versus EU disagreement. It is being discussed as a test of whether Europe will defend the principles it claims to stand for. When doing so becomes costly, trade retaliation carries real economic consequences. Standing up to the United States is not easy. But the consensus forming in European capitals is that the cost of submission would be far higher. Trump's approach, meanwhile, appears increasingly isolated. His framing of the issue, as if tariffs are simply another negotiating chip, has failed to account for how seriously Europeans take questions of sovereignty and collective security. To them, this is not a deal-making exercise. It is a line that cannot be crossed without unraveling the fabric of alliances that have held for decades. The irony is that Trump's tactic may end up strengthening the very unity he seems to resent. By threatening multiple countries at once, he has forced them to coordinate. By escalating publicly, he has made it politically impossible for European leaders to quietly compromise. Backing down individually would now look like capitulation, not pragmatism, and that dynamic locks everyone into a more confrontational posture. Inside Europe, public opinion is also shifting. Voters who once viewed the United States as an imperfect but reliable ally are now being confronted with a version of American leadership that feels erratic and punitive. That shift matters. It gives European leaders political cover to push back harder and invest more heavily in independent economic and defense strategies. As emergency meetings continue and statements pile up, one thing is clear: Trump's attempt to assert dominance through economic threats has instead exposed his weakness. Power relies on credibility, and credibility relies on consistency. When allies begin planning around you rather than with you, influence erodes quickly. Europe is now acting on the assumption that it cannot count on restraint from Washington. That assumption will shape policy long after this particular crisis fades. Trade deals may stall, defense coordination may change, diplomatic engagement may become more cautious and conditional, all because one threat forced a reckoning. And that is why European leaders are treating this moment as pivotal. Not just another Trump outburst, not just another round of bluster, but a clear signal that the old assumptions no longer apply. Whether Trump intended it or not, he has pushed Europe closer to a future where it prepares for pressure from every direction, including from the country that once anchored its security. That is the true consequence of this episode. Not the tariffs themselves, but the realization they produced. Once that realization sets in, there is no easy way back.